Okay. Okay. I just want to dedicate this year in memory of a Talmud of mine who recently passed away. I think today, actually, the family is getting up from Shiva. Yosef Margolis. I think Yosef ben Yaakov Margolis. And he was a Talmud that over the years, I had connections with him. You know, there are students, and I differentiate between Talmidim and students. There are students who they come into the shir and they leave the shir. And there are Talmidim who, even after they move away, they go other places, but there is a continuation of a relationship. And with Yossi Margolis, that he was one of those Talmidim who the relationship continued. And I remember that many years ago, that's when he became engaged to his wife, Renee. At that time, it was during, my impression was, it was during the period of Sefiras Haomer, or around that time. And we were discussing the Indian of Sefiras Haomer. And I discussed this, some of what I'm going to discuss today in the shir, I had discussed with him at that time. And he was especially, the sugya was of special interest to him at that time because he was a Talmud of, besides being a Talmud of the members of my immediate family, myself, my brothers, my father, his wife's family was especially close with my uncle and the Lubavitcher Rabbi. And some of the ideas contained in this Indian that I discussed with him about Sefiras Haomer was based on ideas that were expressed that I heard from my father and and I saw in the writings of my uncle and the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Now, it's well known, the Shita of the Bahag. The Bahag Shita is that if somebody forgot to count Sefiras Haomer at night, so in the day he can count without a bracha. And then the following night he can continue counting with a bracha. Let's say somebody counted the first night, the second night, and the third night, he forgot to count Sefiras Haomer. But he counted in the day of the third day, the Sefira. So he should count it in the day without a bracha. And the fourth night, he can continue to count with a bracha. However, if a whole 24-hour period passes by, the third day, he didn't count neither at night nor in the day. So the fourth day, he does not count anymore, neither at night nor in the day with a bracha. Seemingly, he no longer has the mitzvah. Now, whereas many interpret the Bahag from the perspective that if you that all the 49 days of Sefiras Haomer are part of one mitzvah. My father, my uncle, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe, they rejected that perspective completely. And their feeling was that even according to the Bahag, the mitzvah each day of Sefiras Haomer is a separate mitzvah. And if a person forgets to count the Sefira one whole day, so it's not that the previous days he did not fulfill the mitzvah. The previous days he did fulfill the mitzvah, but the mitzvah is a mitzvah of counting. So 1, 2, 3 is a count. If you skip 4, 5 is no longer a count. Now, if a person counts during the day, so he doesn't have the mitzvah because the mitzvah is counting at night, but the day is counted. So if a person forgot to count according to the Bahag, the Sefiras Haomer, on the fourth night, so, but he counted in the day. So the day is counted. So at night, he can continue, on the 5th night, he can continue counting with a bracha. So let's say if somebody knows that they're going to undergo an operation and they will not be able to count a number of days, nevertheless, the days up to the day of the operation, he has the mitzvah. And he should count with a bracha. It also has application. Let's say someone is a cotton, and he gets bar mitzvah. The Minchas Chinuch raises that question. He becomes bar mitzvah in the middle of Sefiras Haomer. So even if we assume, and Reb Chaim did not assume that way, but even if we assume that what he did as a cotton was only chinuch and was not the fulfillment of any mitzvah, nevertheless, he can continue counting after his bar mitzvah with a bracha, because the days were counted. Even if we assume that before he became a gadol, before he became an adult, before his bar mitzvah, he didn't fulfill a mitzvah, and that in itself is questionable at best. Nevertheless, he can continue counting because those days were counted, whether he fulfilled the mitzvah or he didn't fulfill the mitzvah. So that's the Bahag's opinion. The Bahag's opinion is that each day is a separate mitzvah. I know that the Mishnah Berurah says to the reverse, but each day is a separate mitzvah. But if a person misses a day, so afterwards he no longer has a mitzvah. But the days that he counted, he fulfilled the mitzvah. And the truth of the matter is that the logic is that way. So the question arises as to how could there be a shita that disagrees? That even if you miss a day, Tosas brings such a shita, I think, in the name of Rabbeinu Tam, that it seems from the Chinuch also that the Rashba shita might have been that way. That even if you miss a day, Even if you miss a day, you could still continue to count. You can still continue to count. After all, after the day you missed, it's no longer a count. 1, 2, 3, 4 is a count. If you miss 5, 6 is no longer a count. So how is it considered? How could it be considered a continuation of the count? How could it be a valid count? How could 5 be a valid count if you didn't count 4? Now, many years ago, I had suggested an answer to that question. And as a matter of fact, I was once invited a number of years ago there was a kollel in Peterson Park in Chicago. Rabbi David Siegel was the head of that kollel. He invited me on a Shavuos to give a shir, and I gave the shir about the Sefiras Haomer, and I mentioned the explanation that I heard from my father, that also my uncle and the Lubavitcher Rebbe suggested. And I raised that same question. How is it that according to those who disagree, and those who say that even if you miss a day, the other days you have a mitzvah, but how it's Torah says, "Usfartem lachem," you shall count. Once you miss a day, it's no longer a count. And at that time, I suggested an answer that the mitzvah of counting Sefira, yes, it's a mitzvah on each individual, but the mitzvah on each individual is to participate in the count of Klal Yisrael, in the count of all the Jewish people. So that's the shita of those who are cholik. In other words, it's not just my individual count. I am required to participate in the count as an individual. As an individual, I am required to participate in the count of the Jewish people. And even if I miss one day, that count continues because the other Jewish people counted. And that's the nature of the mitzvah. And at that time, I remember Rabbi David Siegel called me. That was Motzei, the day after Shavuos. He called me and he said that there is a raya for what I said on the basis of the Lashon of the Chinuch. Because when the Chinuch mentions that shita, he says, Yimne im Shor Yisrael. He continues to count with the other Jewish people. Why did he have to put in to continue the count with the other Jewish people? Obviously, the Chinuch had reference to this svara that I had suggested, that the mitzvah of Sefiras Haomer, even though it's a mitzvah on the individual, but it's a mitzvah on the individual to participate in the count, in the national count, if you want to call it, in the count of Klal Yisrael, of the Jewish people. Now, and not a year later or 2 years later, I came across this shir of my uncle about Sefiras Haomer. Now each Talmud writes over my uncle's shiurim a little differently, and each one sometimes mentions ideas, important ideas, but that the other one didn't mention. You have to, in order to get the whole perspective of what my uncle said in his shiurim, sometimes you have to read the notes of many different Talmidim and then put them together. And my uncle gave the same teretz that I had suggested. At that time, I was unaware that my uncle said it. I would have mentioned it in his name. And he mentioned also the raya that Rav David Siegel suggested to me from the expression of the Chiduch. A matter of fact, I think that this idea is almost explicit in the Lashon of the Rambam. At that time, I didn't mention it. I didn't take notice of it. But the Rambam, when he discusses who is required in the mitzvah of Sefiras Haomer, so he says, Kol ish me Yisrael. Women are exempt. But he says, but he says, Kol ish me Yisrael. Why did he have to emphasize? Very often the Rambam says women are exempt from mitzvahs hasei shazman grama. But why did he have to emphasize Kol ish me Yisrael? It's true, we have a Gzeres HaKasuv that tells us that every Jew is required, not just Bezdin is required. But in final analysis, it's a requirement on every individual Jew. Why did the Rambam have to put in Kol ish me Yisrael, that expression? Every man in Israel is required. So in other words, of course, when the Rambam, whenever he talks about mitzvos, about who's required in mitzvos, it's obviously he's talking about the Jewish men, where the mitzvah, the requirement is only on men. Why did he have to emphasize here, Kol ish me Yisrael? But it's obvious that the Rambam also felt that the mitzvah of Sefiras Haomer is to participate in the count of the Jewish people. For whatever the reason is, there are all kinds of possibilities. But I want to focus today. And it's interesting, there is a Sefiras Haomer that is brought in the Ran at the end of Psachim that seems to say, there are different ways of reading it, but that seems to say that a person who counted the first day, even if he missed some days afterwards, so long as he counted the first day, can continue counting afterwards. Now, my father and my uncle, they explained that shita with the same idea. In other words, each day is a mitzvah of counting. But whereas the Bahag held that if you forgot a whole day, it ceases to be a count. So you no longer are considered counting the next day. Their shita is that so long as you counted the first day, it's considered a count. I want to suggest something and perhaps add something to it. I want to suggest that yes, it's considered a count, but not because even if you miss days, it's still considered a count, as my father and my uncle suggested. But we could suggest that if you counted the first day, you are a member of those of Klal Yisrael. You're part of the group of Klal Yisrael that's counting Sefiras Haomer. But if you missed a day, the first day, if you missed the first day, you're no longer part of that group. Of course, you're Jewish. You're part of Klal Yisrael, but you're not part of the counters who are counting for Klal Yisrael. And in order for your count to be considered a continuation of that count, you have to be part of the counters. So that's the way we could explain the Shitas Agonim. In other words, the Shitas Agonim that says so long as you counted the first day, even if you miss other days, you could continue counting. We don't paskin like that Shita, but we could suggest an alternative shot that, in other words, you have to be part of the counters, part of the group of the counters. And you become part of the group of the counters if you count on the first day. Now, but I want to explain this idea that counting, that when you're counting, it's not just your individual count. You as an individual have a responsibility to count together with the other Jewish people, together with Klal Yisrael, to participate in their count. On a hashkafa level, how are we to understand it? Now, this past week, Sedra, we had the mitzvah of Ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Now, I have discussed many times this thought that I'm going to express now, but I don't think I applied it to Sefiras Haomer. Rashi mentions the Gemara that Rabbi Akiva said, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha zu klal gadol b'Torah." It's a great principle of the Torah. Now we understand how v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha could be the foundation for the mitzvos bein adam lechaveiro, between one man and his friend. But the question is, how is the mitzvah v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha to be seen as a mitzvah, to be seen as a mitzvah of, as a great klal, as a principle, a great principle, as a foundation for the mitzvahs bein adam l'racham, between man and God, between the Jew and his creator. And even more troubling is the story of the ger, or the person who wanted to undergo gerus, who approached Hillel and said to Hillel, "Explain me, tell me the whole Torah while I'm standing on one foot." And Hillel said to him, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, don't do to somebody else what you don't want for yourself," which is the mitzvah of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. And the rest of the Torah is an explanation of that mitzvah. And the question is, yes, we could see how the mitzvahs bein adam lechaveiro, the mitzvahs between man and man, is the foundation for the mitzvahs, that v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha is a foundation for those mitzvahs. But here too, and perhaps even more so, how could we say that the mitzvahs bein adam l'mokom, the mitzvahs between God and man, are an explanation of the mitzvah v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha? And that's not my question. Rashi asks the question. But I want to suggest another answer. And whenever I discuss this inyan, I mention the Gemara talks about the two kruvim, the two figures that were in the Kodesh Kodashim, in the Holy of Holies, either on top of the Aron or on the side of the Aron, or both. And there are two psukim, two verses that seem to contradict each other. One verse says, "Upneim ishalochiv," that the two kruvim faced each other. And the other verse says, "Upneihem in Yoel, upneihem ishal abayis," that the two figures, on the contrary, showed their backs to each other, and they faced the walls of the Beis Hamikdash. And the Gemara gives two answers, but one answer the Gemara gives, kan osin ritzono shel makom, kan ein osin ritzono shel makom. When the Jewish people were doing the will of God, when they were acting properly, the two kruvim that were in the Beis Hamikdash, that were in the Mishkan, they faced each other. It was pneihem mishalachiv. Their face faced each other. But when the Jewish people were not acting in accordance with the will of God, miraculously, the faces of the kruvim did not face each other, but they faced the walls of the Beis Hamikdash. And again, the question arises, if we are to assume that these two figures represent the Jewish people, so how is it that facing each other is a symbol of osin ritzono shel makom, of doing the will of God, when we know that a large part of the Torah is bein adam lamakom, between God and man, between God and the Jew? So how is it that the facing of each other is used as a sign to show whether the Jewish people are fully committed and in full compliance with the will of God, or they're not in compliance and not acting with the manner that God wants them to act? And even more than that, how is it that facing the walls of the Beis Hamikdash could be a symbol of ein osin ritzono shel makom, of not doing the will of God? Now, the Torah tells us that when the Jewish people came to Har Sinai, it was, the Torah says, "Vayichan sham Yisrael neged Har." The Jewish people camped next or opposite the mountain. And Rashi points out, but the Medrash sends it in a much more lengthy manner, that everywhere else, when the Jewish people camped in the Midbar, they camped in the desert, it was vayachnu. It was in a plural form. But here, when they camped by Mount Sinai, it was vayichan in the singular form. And he says, why? So the way the Medrash says it, Rashi only mentions it in a partial manner. Every time they camped, there was, when people set up camp, Each person takes his space. There tends to be some dispute, some conflict. But when they came to Mount Sinai, it was by Yichan. It was in a single form. Ish echad b'leiv echad, like one person with one heart. And as the Medrash says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, let me use this opportunity to give them the Torah. It seems that for the Jewish people to receive the Torah, it was important that they be like one person with one heart. And the question is why? Why was it necessary? But the answer is, the reason it was necessary to be like one person with one heart was because when we accepted the Torah, we didn't just accept the Torah for ourselves, but we accepted the Torah for all Jewish people. And to a certain degree, true, this is completed when the Jewish people enter Eretz Yisrael. But this is the idea of one Jew having a responsibility for another Jew. Arvus, I'm an Orev, I'm a surety. Now, how could we accept the Torah for somebody else? But if we're like one person with one heart, we can accept the Torah for somebody else. Now, it's very interesting. I always mention the Ramban. The Ramban says, ask the question, I mentioned it just recently. The Ramban asked the question, he thinks each Chumash has a certain theme. And the theme of Chumash Shmos is the Exodus, Yetzias Mitzrayim. So up to Matan Torah, we understand Matan Torah is the fulfillment of HaKadosh Baruch Hu taking us as his nation. V'lakachti eschem li la'am. I will take you as for me as a nation. So, in a sense, Matan Torah represents the idea of Yetzias Mitzrayim. But what is the second half of Chumash Shmos, the Ramban asks, which discusses about the construction of the Mishkan? What does that have to do with the theme of Chumash Shmos? Oh, yeah, it's true. It was after they left Egypt. But so was Chumash Bamidbar. So much was Chumash Vayikra. So was Chumash Dvarim. And the Ramban says the purpose of the Mishkan was to serve as a vehicle to transfer Dushas Har Sinai to Yerushalayim. In other words, the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash is the perpetuation of Sinai. And I always mention that in the Haggadah, in the Dayenu, we say, Ilu kirvanu lefnei Har Sinai, if God brought us close at Mount Sinai, below Nasan Lanu as a Torah, and didn't give us the Torah, Dayenu, that in itself would have been great. What would have been so great about coming to Mount Sinai and not receiving the Torah? But the answer is that in addition, Kirvanu doesn't mean he's brought us close to Mount Sinai, but he brought us close to him. We sense the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There was revelation. And I think to a certain degree, we could suggest along the lines that I mentioned that we had revelation only because we were ke'ish echad b'leiv echad. There are many reasons for that, but that was part of the experience of Mount Sinai. The Torah of Sinai is important, but the Torah, it's not enough to perpetuate. It's not enough to perpetuate the Torah of Sinai unless we can perpetuate the experience of Sinai. And the experience of Sinai is based on the presence of the Shekhinah. And the Kedusha, the sanctity of Mount Sinai, was the Kedusha of the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the presence of the Shekhinah. The Rambam says that the Kedushas HaMikdash is a permanent Kedusha. Why? Because Kedusha Shekhinah is permanent. And the Kedusha Shekhinah is the Kedusha Shekhinah. It's the sanctity of the presence of God that was at Mount Sinai. So the idea of the Mishkan and the Beis Hamikdash was the perpetuation of the receiving of the Torah, but not just the receiving of the Torah, but the whole experience of Sinai as well. And part of the experience, but it's not just the experience of Sinai that we perpetuate cannot be limited to God's revelation, but it has to be the experience of the way the Jewish people act at Sinai also. And when we said Nasa v'nishma, we said Nasa v'nishma not just for ourselves. We said Nasa v'nishma, we will do and we will listen for all the Jewish people. We assumed responsibility for all the Jewish people, and we were only able to do so because we were ke'ish echad b'leiv echad. We were one person with one heart. And that's the idea of Bnei Mishalachiv. The idea of Kabbalah Torah was that it wasn't just a one-time event that was in the past, but we constantly have to re-accept the Torah, to be committed to the Torah. So when Pnei Mishalachiv, that's indicative that that we are doing our part in perpetuating Sinai. We're osin ritzono shel makom if we are perpetuating Sinai. If we're not perpetuating Sinai, we're not doing ritzono shel makom. And to a certain degree, we could interpret v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. It's not enough to be devoted to your friend. It's not enough to be sensitive to your friend. But in a sense, you and your friend have to be one. Kamocha! He has to be the same as you. Mitzvah v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha ki'ish echad b'leiv echad. You have to feel his joy. You have to feel his pain. They say over that Moshe Sasaver, the Hasidic thought, he said that when is it that a person is, how he said, he didn't understand the mitzvah of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha till he overheard two Russian peasants talking to each other. And one said, "I'm in pain." And the other said, "What's wrong?" And the person said, "If you would really be my friend, you would know what's wrong. You would know the pain. You would feel the pain." That's the idea, ki'ish echad b'leiv echad. And as difficult as it is, to feel the pain of somebody else, sometimes it's even more difficult to feel the joy of somebody else. And I think to share the joy of somebody else, you have to be able to share your joy with somebody else. The Rambam says that when it comes to Simchas Yontif, if a person locks himself in his house and he has a very good meal, and it's just him and his family, he doesn't really fulfill the mitzvah of Simchas Yontif. It's only when you invite people who are in need, people who won't be happy, that it's real simcha. Because real simcha, real joy, is joy that can be shared. But joy that cannot be shared is not real simcha. So this is the idea of Pnei Mishalachiv, that represents the idea that the Jewish people are perpetuating not just the Torah, but Kabbalas HaTorah as well. And that's why the building of the Mishkan is the continuation and the perpetuation of Matan Torah. And it's only, we have to recognize the Jewish people, when we're one with the Jewish people, then it's v'lakachti eschem li la'am. It's the idea of eschem. Now, so that's why Hillel said v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, because when it's v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, then you could perpetuate Matan Torah, and the whole Torah is the explanation of the perpetuation of Matan Torah. And I think that to a certain degree, now what is Sefiras Haomer? The Iran cites a medrash, but the basic idea of Sefiras Haomer is that to a certain degree, Sefiras Haomer was a perpetuation or a re-experiencing of the Jewish people looking forward to Matan Torah. The Ran cites a medrash that the Jewish people asked Moshe Rabbeinu, and I mentioned this recently, when are we going to come to Har Sinai? When are we going to get the Torah? When is God going to reveal himself in a permanent way? There was revelation at Kriyas Yamsuf, but the revelation at Har Sinai was something unique. That was permanent. And Moshe Rabbeinu told them in 50 days. And the Jewish people began to count the days. And that's the foundation of Matan Torah. Now, I always mention, we don't say today is the first day, today is the second day, today is the third day. Matter of fact, that's one shiloh that always arises. Let's say if somebody asks you, what day of Sefiras is it? And you say, today is the third day. Some will tell you, you can't make a brach anymore. You already yotzei the mitzvah. You fulfilled the mitzvah. When saying the third day, you do not fulfill the mitzvah. Only if you say 3 days, 4 days, 5 days. Why is it? But as I've mentioned, because Sefiras Haomer are not days that we pass through. As one goes on a highway. No, those are days we take with us. because these are the days the Jewish people, yes, the Jewish people had the impact of slavery on them. They were not yet ready for Kabbalah Torah. But if they just counted days and they didn't take the days with them, and there were lots of problems in those days, we can learn from our bad experiences as well as from our good experiences. But if we don't take the experiences of those days, then we weren't ready for Kabbalah Torah. And the idea, so the experience of Matan Torah, in a sense, is the people coming together. So coming together, perhaps that's part of the reason why Sefiras Haomer has to be a count of the tzibur. Each person has to see himself as part of the tzibur, as part of Klal Yisrael. Has to see himself as part of Klal Yisrael. But so consequently, it's a mitzvah of joining with others in the count. In a sense, it's our preparation of being ki'ish echad b'leiv echad, being like one person. It's not just my own count. So that's why the mitzvah of Sefiras Haomer is that way. Now, I want to just add a few words about Yossi Margolis. He was a person who was Pnei Mishalachiv. He was always concerned. He went out of his way. First of all, he was a person that always had a smile on his face. He seemed to be in a state of perpetual happiness. That's very difficult. But for everybody and anybody. But what was unique about him was that somehow, when you were with him, somehow that had an impact on the other individuals as well. He was able to share, it wasn't necessarily the simcha of just wild simcha. As so many today people think today, simcha was wild. It was on the contrary. But he was able to share that simcha with many people. He went out of his way to share that simcha with people. Whether it was people who were in a nursing home or whatever it was, somehow when you came in contact with him, you were able to share that simcha, that pleasantness simcha that he had. I mentioned that one of the big questions during Sefiras Haomer is, now for us, Sefira on one hand is our march to Har Sinai. On the other hand, Sefiras Haomer is identified with a sense of mourning because of the Talmidim, the students of Rabbi Akiva who died during the period of Sefiras Haomer. And many reasons are given for the celebration of Lag BaOmer. Lag BaOmer is next week. And many reasons are given for it. And one of the reasons, perhaps next week I'll discuss it more at length, we'll see. But one of the reasons given is because that's when the Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva stopped dying. Now it's very strange that the Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva stopped dying simply because they all died. So what are we celebrating? We're celebrating that they that they all died, that there was no one left to die. What is the celebration all about? But I think part of the idea is we're re-experiencing the mourning, the pain that Klal Yisrael felt when they saw the students of Rabbi Akiva dying, because they saw them as the continuation, as the perpetuation of the Masorah. I think Rashi points out they were all over Eretz Yisrael. They were in many different places. And there was a hope, and people were looking for the perpetuation and the continuation of Torah through these students of Rabbi Akiva who died. And then they stopped dying. But while they were dying, there was a sense of mourning. But somehow the Jewish people, sometimes when a person gets into a state of sadness, in a state of depression, it becomes difficult to leave that state of depression. Yes, we encounter events that cause us to feel depressed. We all encounter difficulties, and perhaps a better word is challenges. If we see, but we somehow can arise above it. There are people who give up, but there are people who persist. The Torah tells us that when Yaakov thought that Yosef was gone, so when Yaakov thought Joseph was gone, so he pushed aside all consolation. But then when he heard that Joseph is alive, when he heard, oh, Joseph Chai, that Joseph is alive, so then, V'tefi ruach Yaakov avihim, Yaakov became alive again. And I think the celebration of Lag BaOmer is that we were able to get out of that depression. And we have to get out of that depression. And Chazal tell us that when Yaakov died, so that Yaakov Lomes, Yaakov didn't die. Because so long as the children of Yaakov, so long as those who Yaakov had an impact on are alive, Yaakov remains alive also. Because I'll tell us in Gemara Brachas that somebody who is sick, someone who is overcome with a sense of gloom, as the Gemara describes it in Brachas. So you stretch out a hand to get that person up. Someone who's in prison cannot free himself from jail. He needs someone to stretch out a hand. Yosef Margolis with his happiness that he shared with others. He was constantly stretching out his hand and pulling people out of their depression, out of their sadness, out of their situation where they needed a little light. Ma'at min ha'or docha harbe min ha'choshech. Me'afeil la'ora. That was what his life was dedicated to. He was dedicated to his family, dedicated to his children. And dedicated to all Jews. Somehow he was able, that happiness that was a real part of him. It wasn't just a momentary expression. He was able to share it with others. He was able to stick his hands out and help people get out of their gloom, out of their darkness. And he had that impact on himself, on others, and on his children, and on his family. And we could say that so long as the children of Yosef are here, and the children of Yosef continue for many generations, so long as the people that he had an impact is here. Oh, Joseph Chai, he continues to live. He lives within us. We saw there was a person, we saw the idea of happiness. And that sense of happiness was not something that he kept to himself. It was something that he shared with others. So in the happiness, in our ability to deal with situations that he helped so many people come out of, he remains alive. And we have to continue that tradition of contributing to Ish Echad B'Leiv Echad, being sensitive to people, sensing sometimes their sadness, sensing their joy, and most important of all, sharing our joy with others as well, our happiness with others as well. That's who Yosef Margolis is. And if we will do that, he will continue to live through us.
If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat.